A crowded airplane, the hum of engines. A boy, only 15, sits quietly in Seat 1A, the seat his father bought for him. But then comes the moment no child should face. A voice, sharp and dismissive, "That seat isn't for you. Move." Imagine the stares of strangers pressing down on you, the weight of judgment saying you don't belong. Your ticket is valid, your place is earned, and yet you're asked to give it up simply because of who you are. In that instant, you face a choice: surrender your dignity, or hold your ground and risk the storm that follows. This is the story of Malik Johnson, a boy who chose to stay. His decision, made in fear but rooted in courage, didn't just protect his seat, it shook an airline and awakened a nation. One seat became a symbol. One voice became a spark. If you were Malik, what would you have done? Could you have stayed, even as the world told you to move? Join us as we uncover a story of quiet defiance, powerful justice, and the unshakable truth of human dignity. Please like, share, and subscribe, because this journey is one you won't want to miss. The first-class cabin of Flight 782 glowed softly in the late afternoon light. Golden rays slipped through the oval windows, brushing against the polished armrests and glimmering on the silver buckles of leather seatbelts. For many passengers, it was just another business trip, another commute in the sky. But for 15-year-old Malik Johnson, this was a day he would remember for the rest of his life. He sat quietly in Seat 1A, the very front of the cabin. To anyone else, it was just another first-class seat, wide, luxurious, reclining with endless comfort. But to Malik, it was more than just a seat. It was a gift from his father, a symbol of trust, a rite of passage. Malik's father, David Johnson, was a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms across America. CEO of a powerful aerospace technology company, David had built his empire from nothing but grit and brilliance. But at home, to Malik, he was simply Dad, a man who promised him that one day he would learn what it meant to hold his head high, no matter who tried to push him down. That day had come. Before boarding, David had placed his hand on Malik's shoulder and said softly, "Son, Seat 1A is yours, not because I paid for it, but because you deserve to sit there. Remember, never let anyone make you believe otherwise." Those words echoed in Malik's heart as he settled into the wide leather chair. He looked down at the boarding pass still clutched in his hand. His name clearly printed above the bold letters Seat 1A. He traced the ink with his finger like a signature of destiny. The cabin around him hummed with life. Businessmen scrolled through tablets. A young woman in a navy coat adjusted her briefcase. The air carried the faint aroma of coffee and leather, mixed with the distant hum of engines. Malik leaned back, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. He had never flown alone before, and certainly not like this sitting where captains of industry and celebrities often sat. His mother had slipped a small notebook into his backpack that morning, whispering, "Write down what you feel up there. Someday you'll want to remember." So he opened it now. On the first page, he wrote, "I am in Seat 1A. Dad said I earned this." The words steadied him like an anchor, yet beneath the calm, Malik felt a flicker of nervous energy. Not fear, exactly. More like the trembling excitement before stepping onto a stage. He was used to being underestimated in classrooms, on basketball courts, even at the grocery store. His father always told him that the world sometimes looked at young black boys and decided who they were before they even spoke. But Malik carried himself with quiet dignity, as his parents had taught him. Here, in Siat 1A, he wanted to prove, if only to himself, that he belonged. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the murmurs of passengers settling in. The voice of a flight attendant drifted through the cabin. Cheerful but professional ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 782 non-stop service to New York. The announcement wrapped around him like background music. Malik adjusted his seatbelt and imagined the plane soaring above the clouds. For the first time in weeks, he felt a calm sense of pride. But calm moments rarely last long. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a woman entering the cabin. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed her space. Dressed in an expensive cream-colored jacket, diamond earrings catching the light, her every step declared privilege. Her name, though Malik didn't know it yet, was Eleanor Briggs. She paused near seat 1A. Her sharp blue eyes landed on Malik. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face, then hardened into something sharper. Malik looked up politely, offering a small nod as his mother had taught him, but Eleanor didn't return the courtesy. Instead, she tilted her head, studying him the way someone might study a misplaced object. He shifted uncomfortably, clutching his boarding pass tighter. The silence stretched, heavy, until the woman spoke in a tone laced with disdain. "Excuse me, young man. You're sitting in my seat." Her words sliced through the quiet hum of the cabin. Malik blinked, startled. He glanced again at his boarding pass, then back at the number glowing above his seat, 1A. His name matched. Everything matched. He cleared his throat gently. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly, holding up the boarding pass. "This is my seat?" Eleanor's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "No, that's impossible. Seat 1A is reserved for Platinum Elite members. It always is. You must have made a mistake." Passengers nearby glanced up from their screens, sensing the tension. A businessman 2 rows back adjusted his tie, pretending not to eavesdrop. The young woman in the navy coat froze mid-motion, eyes flicking between them. Malik felt a tightening in his chest. His father's words echoed again. "Seat 1A is yours, because you deserve it." He forced his voice steady. "I didn't make a mistake. My boarding pass says seat 1A. My name is right here." He extended the ticket, hoping to settle the matter quickly, but Eleanor didn't even look. She simply shook her head, her tone dripping with certainty. Platinum comes first. Always. And with that, the calmness of Malik's first flight began to unravel. The words hung in the air, heavy and certain, as if Eleanor Briggs had spoken a rule etched into stone. Malik felt his pulse quicken. He shifted in his seat, the leather squeaking beneath him, his fingers still wrapped around the thin piece of paper that seemed to carry the weight of his dignity. Seat 1A. His name printed in bold, around them. The cabin quieted in a subtle but unmistakable way. A hush spread like ripples across water. Passengers pretended to read their newspapers or scroll their phones, but their eyes darted up, stealing glances at the scene. Eleanor didn't budge. Her perfectly polished nails tapped against the handle of her designer bag as she spoke again. Sharper this time. "Young man, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm Platinum Elite. I always sit here. You can move to another seat. Surely they can find you something." Her voice carried a practiced authority, the kind people use when they expect the world to bend without question. Malik swallowed hard. He felt his throat tighten, but he steadied himself. His father's voice lived in the back of his mind. Dignity is not given. You carry it with you. You stand firm, no matter who stands against you. He lifted his chin, his voice calm, though his palms grew damp. "Ma'am, I'm not moving. This is my seat." The air shifted. A couple sitting across the aisle exchanged glances. The woman's eyes softened, but she said nothing. The man stared at his tablet screen as though nothing unusual was happening. Silence became complicity. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Where are your parents?" she asked, her tone slicing into Malik's confidence. "Does someone know you're up here? Maybe you wandered into the wrong cabin?" Malik felt the sting, not just of her words, but of the weight behind them. The unspoken suggestion that a boy like him did not belong in first class, that his very presence was an error. "I'm not lost," Malik answered, his voice steady, though quieter now. "I belong here." For a moment, Eleanor looked almost amused, as though she were humoring a child's fantasy. Then her expression hardened again. She flagged down a passing attendant with a flick of her manicured hand. The flight attendant, Susan Miller, hurried over. She was older, with tired eyes that had seen decades of service in the air. She stopped at Eleanor's side, her professional smile quickly replaced by confusion as she took in the standoff. "What seems to be the issue?" Susan asked. Eleanor gestured toward Malik. "This young man is in my seat. I'm Platinum Elite. I always sit in 1A. Get him moved, please." Susan turned to Malik, her expression politely neutral, though her brows drew together slightly. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Malik handed it over, his hands steady now, though his heartbeat thundered in his chest. Susan scanned the ticket, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Seat 1A," she read aloud, confirming what Malik already knew. "Yes," Malik said, his voice calm but resolute. But instead of ending the matter, Susan hesitated. She glanced at Eleanor, then back at Malik. Her training told her to de-escalate conflict, to smooth over problems, to prioritize premium passengers who made the airline money. And here stood Eleanor Briggs, a woman who clearly carried clout. "Perhaps," Susan said carefully, "we can find another seat for you, young man. There are a few open in business class. It might be easier for everyone if you just..." "No." The word cut sharper than Malik intended. He drew in a breath, steadied himself, and tried again. "No. Thank you. I'll stay here. This is my seat." Susan blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in his tone. Eleanor let out a sharp laugh. "You see, this is the problem. Kids these days think they can demand anything. Platinum status means something. I've spent years earning it. I deserve this seat." Malik looked at her, his dark eyes unwavering. "I didn't take anything from you. My father bought this seat for me. It has my name on it. I'm not giving it up." The firmness of his voice startled even himself, but he meant every word. The tension coiled tighter, the cabin pressing in around him. He felt exposed, every eye weighing on his small frame, judging whether he belonged, whether he was brave or foolish. From behind, a voice broke through the silence. "He's right." An older man, his hair silver, leaned into the aisle. Mr. Walters, a frequent flyer whose eyes had seen both the kindness and cruelty of strangers, looked directly at Eleanor. "The boy has the ticket." Walters said simply, "Seat 1A belongs to him." For a moment, Malik felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Eleanor straightened, her face reddening. You have no idea what you're talking about. This is not about a ticket. It's about status. People like me keep this airline alive. Without platinum members, none of this even exists." She gestured broadly, her diamond bracelet flashing in the cabin lights. Susan shifted uncomfortably, torn between policy and appeasement. Malik caught her hesitation. The way her gaze flickered toward Eleanor as though silently calculating the consequences of siding with her. And in that hesitation, Malik understood this wasn't just about a seat. It was about something larger. The unspoken weight of privilege, the ease with which someone like Eleanor could bend rules, the fragility of a boy's dignity when placed against a woman who believed her worth outweighed his very presence. Malik's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. He wasn't calling his father out of weakness. He wasn't calling because he couldn't defend himself. He was calling because sometimes, no matter how calm or firm you stand, the world refuses to hear your voice until someone with power forces it to listen. He tapped his father's number. The dial tone rang once, twice, then connected. On the other end, David Johnson's voice was calm, steady, and grounding. Malik breathed out, the air shaky in his chest. "Dad, they're trying to take my seat." There was a pause. Then his father spoke with the certainty of a man who had built empires. "Son, don't move. Seat 1A is yours. I'll take care of it." Malik closed his eyes, the words anchoring him. The calm in his father's voice reminded him of late-night talks, of lessons whispered at the kitchen table about dignity, about not folding under pressure. "Okay, Dad," Malik said softly. When he opened his eyes again, Eleanor was still standing there, incredulous that he hadn't moved. Susan hovered nearby, caught in limbo. Brian Scott, another attendant, had joined them, his lips pressed tightly as he tried to avoid involvement. The moment stretched, heavy and unresolved. Malik sat in silence, his phone still warm in his hand, his boarding pass like a shield on his lap. Outside the window, the runway stretched long into the horizon. Waiting. Inside the cabin, a battle of willpower simmered. And though Malik was just one boy, his calm refusal to rise from seat 1A had set events into motion that none of them could have predicted. Because on the other end of that phone call, David Johnson was already moving. He was not just a father. He was a CEO who understood systems, contracts, leverage, and he was about to use every tool at his disposal to remind this airline, and everyone watching, that dignity was not negotiable. And for Malik, sitting quietly in seat 1A, the story was only beginning. The hum of the aircraft's ventilation filled the tense silence that followed Malik's phone call. He placed the device back into his pocket, sitting upright with his shoulders squared, his hands folded in his lap as though he were preparing for a test he had long studied for. Across from him, Eleanor Briggs still loomed, her polished smile replaced by open irritation. The older woman leaned toward the nearest attendant, her voice just loud enough for the rest of the cabin to hear. "Are we really going to let a child dictate how this flight operates? Platinum members keep this airline alive. If he stays, what does that say about your standards?" The statement stung, and Malik felt its echo ripple through the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to their companions. A few shook their heads, others avoided eye contact altogether. The silence of the majority weighed heavier than Eleanor's words. Susan Miller, the supervisor, knelt slightly at Malik's side. Her voice was soft, but edged with urgency. "Listen, sweetheart, We need to get this resolved quickly. We can seat you in business class. You'll still be comfortable. Please cooperate so we don't delay the flight." The word sweetheart hit Malik like a pinprick, condescending, dismissive. He lifted his eyes to hers, calm but firm. "I told you already. This is my seat. My boarding pass says so." From the galley, Brian Scott appeared, folding his arms across his chest as though siding quietly with his supervisor. His presence added to the weight pressing against Malik, a 15-year-old boy in a sea of adults telling him to yield. "Don't be difficult," Susan continued, lowering her voice but letting her frustration show. "We don't want to escalate this." Malik inhaled slowly, grounding himself, his father's words repeated in his memory. "Stand firm, even when the world tells you to move." "I'm not being difficult," he replied, his tone steady. "I'm sitting in the seat my father bought for me." Eleanor's laugh cut through his calmness. "Bought? Do you even know how much the seat costs? I've earned this through loyalty. Do you know what loyalty means? It's years of flying, tens of thousands of dollars spent, not a spoiled boy waving a ticket." Malik flinched but kept his gaze fixed forward. At that moment, Mr. Walters, the older passenger who had spoken earlier, leaned forward again. "The boy has the ticket. This shouldn't even be a discussion." His voice was gravelly but clear, each word like a stone dropped into still water. Several passengers looked at him, some nodding subtly, others quickly glancing away. The tension thickened, a battle line drawn between voices of reason and voices of privilege. Eleanor turned on Walters, her cheeks flushed. "Stay out of this. You don't understand how things work. You're not platinum. You wouldn't know. The dismissal was sharp, almost cruel." Walters sank back into his seat, shaking his head slowly, but he said nothing more. Susan straightened, her professional mask faltering. She looked at Brian, who gave a small nod, as if to say, "Do it." She reached for the phone near the galley. Malik's stomach twisted. He knew she was calling the captain. He stared out the window, the tarmac stretching far into the distance, sunlight shimmering on the painted lines that marked the path for massive engines. He imagined the plane rising above the clouds, imagined the quiet peace of blue skies, but instead he was here, locked in a struggle over whether his presence in seat 1A was valid. He pressed his hands together tightly, whispering in his mind, "Dad will fix this. Just hold on." Back in the galley, Susan's voice was low but tense. "Captain, we have a situation in the cabin. A boy is refusing to vacate a platinum member's seat, requesting immediate guidance." The words weren't meant for Malik's ears, but he heard them all the same. Refusing to vacate as if he were the one breaking rules, as if the boarding pass in his pocket wasn't proof enough. Moments later, Susan returned, straightening her uniform, her voice firmer now. "The captain is aware. If you don't move, young man, we'll have to delay departure. Do you want to be responsible for inconveniencing everyone on this flight?" The guilt pressed heavy. Passengers sighed, some muttering. Malik felt dozens of eyes boring into him. For a split second, he wanted to shrink into the leather, to disappear, to give up the fight. But then his phone buzzed. A short message from his father flashed on the screen. "Hold firm. I'm here." Relief washed over him. His father's presence, though miles away, steadied his trembling heart. He looked at Susan, then Eleanor, then the sea of silent passengers. His voice was low but clear. "I will not move." Eleanor scoffed audibly, This is absurd. Call security if you have to. Get him out of here." The cabin stirred again. A mother, clutching her toddler, whispered, "Why can't they just let the boy sit?" But her voice was drowned by another man's muttered complaint about delays. Malik closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. He thought of nights at the kitchen table when his father spoke about battles fought in boardrooms, about the way power revealed itself in small acts. He thought of his mother telling him that silence in the face of wrong was also a choice. He opened his eyes. "I'm not moving," he repeated, louder this time. The declaration landed like a stone. Even Susan faltered. For the first time, Eleanor blinked, taken aback by the steel in his young voice. Before anyone could respond, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing a brief delay. Thank you for your patience." The cabin groaned collectively. Eleanor threw her hands in the air, muttering, "Unbelievable." Susan pinched the bridge of her nose. Brian whispered something under his breath, shaking his head. But Malik sat still, his hands folded again, his gaze forward. He felt the weight of the moment, the press of judgment all around him. Yet he knew this was bigger than comfort. It was about standing his ground in a world that too often told him he did not belong. And somewhere on the other end of the system, his father was already setting gears in motion. Malik sat perfectly still, yet inside his chest, his heart hammered as though he had run miles. Around him, the cabin seemed to shrink, every glance a spotlight, every sigh a judgment. He had expected this flight to be a memory of pride, a moment to carry in his journal as the day he flew alone in first class. Instead, it had become a stage where strangers debated whether he belonged at all. He stared at the boarding pass resting on his lap, his name printed in dark ink, proof of his right to be there. But the proof didn't quiet the whispers around him, or the cold certainty in Eleanor Briggs's tone when she demanded he move. He closed his eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw flashes of his father, David Johnson, at the kitchen table, leaning forward late at night with that calm intensity in his eyes. "Malik, the world won't always see you for who you are. Sometimes it will see only what it wants to. But remember, you don't move because someone tells you to. You move because you choose to. There's a difference." The words steadied him, but the weight of the moment pressed harder. Should he keep fighting, or was he holding everyone hostage with his stubbornness? He imagined the passengers whispering, "Just let it go. He's only a boy." His fingers trembled as he wrote in his notebook, the one his mother had slipped into his bag. The ink scrawled unevenly. "They want me to give up my seat. I feel small, but Dad said it's mine. I don't know if I'm brave enough." He paused, tapping the pen against the page, trying to slow his thoughts. Susan Miller loomed nearby, her hands clasped, her tone brisk. "Young man, we can't sit here all day. People are waiting. If you would just move to business class, we can be on our way." Malik's lips tightened. He wanted to shout, to cry, to demand why his ticket wasn't enough, but he forced his voice steady. "I can't. This is my seat." Eleanor scoffed audibly. Stubborn child. Someone should teach him respect. Respect. The word echoed bitterly in Malik's mind. Respect for whom? For rules that bent around money, for a system that asked him to shrink so someone else could spread out. He leaned back, trying to breathe, but the air in the cabin felt heavy. His eyes burned. He blinked quickly, refusing to let the tears fall. Not here. not in front of them. The phone in his pocket vibrated again. Another message from his father. "I'm here. Hold on. Proud of you." Malik's chest loosened. He held the words like armor, a shield no one could strip away. But still, doubt gnawed at him. What if they dragged him out? What if the story twisted, painted him as disruptive, dangerous, just another teenager refusing to obey? He had seen those stories before on the news, in videos his father showed him when teaching him the harsh truths of the world. His fingers clenched around the boarding pass. He whispered in his head, "Don't cry, don't break, just breathe." From across the aisle, Mrs. Daniels, a woman with kind eyes, leaned forward slightly. Her voice was quiet. "Just for him. You're doing fine, honey. Don't let them scare you." Malik looked up, startled by the softness in her tone. Her nod gave him a small anchor, a reminder that not everyone in the cabin thought he was a problem to be solved. But Eleanor snapped, glaring at her, "Mind your own business." The brief kindness vanished back into silence. The cabin folded in on itself again. Malik stared down at his notebook. His pen scratched slowly. "I feel alone. But maybe this is what Dad meant. Standing firm when no one else stands with you." The pages blurred as he blinked hard. His body was small in the wide leather chair, but his choice filled every corner of the cabin. He replayed his father's lessons, each one like a hand on his shoulder. Dignity isn't loud, it's steady. Respect yourself first, and others will follow even if it takes time. But what if time didn't come? What if the attendants called security? He pictured uniformed officers storming down the aisle, pulling him from the seat while phones recorded every moment. His face splashed across screens, but not as a boy with dignity, only as a headline teen refuses to move on flight. Fear coiled in his stomach, but he straightened his spine. He whispered into the quiet, "Not for Eleanor, not for Susan, not for anyone but himself I belong here." The words were barely audible, but they gave him strength. Susan pinched the bridge of her nose. Frustration clear. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be. Think about the other passengers." Malik almost broke then. Almost. The weight of collective anger, the sighs, the mutters, it was a storm pressing down on him. But then he remembered his father's face, the certainty in his eyes. "Son, seat 1A is yours. Not because I paid for it, because you deserve it." The truth settled deep in Malik's bones. He wasn't just fighting for a chair. He was fighting for the right to be seen, to be respected, to exist without being told he was less. The silence stretched again. Eleanor fumed. Susan waited. Brian avoided his eyes. Walters stayed quiet. Daniels offered him a sympathetic glance, and Malik, trembling but unyielding, remained seated. In that moment, he knew he had made his choice. He would not move. In a glass-walled conference room high above the skyline of Houston, David Johnson sat at the head of a long oak table. His colleagues, executives in tailored suits, debated numbers on a glowing screen, graphs showing quarterly projections and global partnerships. But David's eyes were fixed on the phone in his hand. The message from Malik still lit across the screen. "They're trying to take my seat." The room's murmur dimmed as David rose without a word. His presence commanded attention even in silence. He excused himself with a calm nod, stepping out into the hallway lined with portraits of past leaders. He had built his company with steady hands and unshakable resolve. But at that moment, he wasn't a CEO. He was a father whose son sat alone, surrounded by strangers doubting his worth. David dialed swiftly, his fingers steady. He didn't need to think. He knew exactly who to call. "Get me the operations director at Atlantic Airways," he said when his assistant answered. His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of a man used to being obeyed. Now, minutes later, a voice came through, hesitant but professional. "Mr. Johnson, what can we do for you?" "My son is sitting on Flight 782 out of Atlanta," David said evenly. "Seat 1A. He has a boarding pass, yet your crew is pressuring him to move for another passenger. That will stop immediately." There was silence on the line, the kind that carried fear. Then the voice stammered. "Sir, I'll look into this right away. Please, hold." David didn't hold. He ended the call. He wasn't waiting for apologies. He was already moving to his next call, this one to a board member he knew personally. His network stretched into the bones of the industry contracts, maintenance deals, data systems his company provided to airlines across the nation. He was not calling as a favor seeker. He was calling as someone whose name could shift markets. Back on the plane. Malik sat straighter, unaware of the calls echoing across states. His father's short message, "Proud of you," still buzzed inside him like a steady drumbeat. But around him, the storm hadn't eased. Susan Miller checked her watch anxiously, whispering with Brian Scott near the galley. Eleanor Briggs stood firm in the aisle, refusing to sit until her rightful seat was given. The cabin remained in limbo, passengers restless, the engines idling in anticipation of takeoff that never came. One child began to fuss 2 rows back, his mother rocking him gently, whispering apologies to nearby travelers. A businessman sighed loudly, muttering about missed meetings. Tension spilled across the cabin like turbulence before takeoff. Malik's hand itched toward his notebook again. He wrote slowly, trying to still his shaking. "Dad said not to move, but everyone is angry. I feel like I'm holding the whole plane hostage." He paused, his throat tight, before adding, "What if I'm wrong?" But then he remembered Mrs. Daniels's quiet encouragement and Walters's gravelly voice. 2 small sparks in the sea of silence. Maybe he wasn't entirely alone. At that same moment, hundreds of miles away. David Johnson's third call connected this time to Richard Coleman, a senior airline representative he had known for years. Richard's voice was cautious. "David, I've just been informed of a situation on one of our flights. Is this about Malik David's jaw tightened?" "It is. And I want you to listen carefully. My son has the ticket. He has the right. If anyone continues to harass him, this will not end as an isolated incident. You know what my company provides to your fleet? You know how quickly I can make calls. Don't test me on this." Richard's silence was heavy, but then came his reply, "I understand. Give me 20 minutes. I'll be on that plane myself." David ended the call, his face unreadable, but inside his chest a storm raged. He remembered Malik at 5 years old, sitting at the kitchen table drawing planes in crayon, his eyes wide with wonder. He remembered Malik asking, "Do they ever see us? Dad people like us." And David had promised one day the world would see his son for who he truly was. Back in seat 1A, Malik felt the cabin door open again. He didn't turn, but he sensed a shift, a presence. Eleanor's ranting slowed as footsteps echoed down the aisle, firmer than the attendant's steps, more deliberate. Malik looked up. 2 men approached, suits crisp, badges visible. One of them, tall and commanding, introduced himself in a steady voice. "My name is Richard Coleman, senior representative of Atlantic Airways. I've been informed of a situation." The cabin hushed instantly. Susan Miller's face drained of color. "Mr. Coleman," not another word. Richard interrupted sharply. His eyes swept the scene, the boy clutching his boarding pass. The woman, standing in the aisle, flushed with indignation. The attendants stiff with unease. He turned to Malik. "Son, may I see your pass?" Malik handed it over, his hands trembling. Richard read it carefully, then looked directly at Eleanor Briggs. His voice carried across the cabin. "Seat 1A belongs to Mr. Malik Johnson. End of discussion." Gasps fluttered among passengers. Eleanor's lips parted, outrage flooding her features. "You can't be serious. I'm Platinum Elite. Do you know who I am?" Richard's gaze hardened. "I don't care who you are. I care about what's right." For the first time, Malik saw Eleanor falter. Her certainty cracked. Susan stammered, "We were just trying to..." Richard cut her off. "You were trying to pressure a minor with a valid ticket. That is unacceptable. You and your crew will answer for this." The words hung in the air like thunder. Malik's chest rose, relief mingling with disbelief. His father's promise was coming to life before his eyes. Someone with authority was standing where others had chosen silence. Eleanor turned, desperate, to the passengers around her. "Surely you all agree. Platinum should come first. That's the system. That's how it's always worked." But the cabin didn't answer. Heads turned away. Some eyes even glared back. The tide was shifting. Malik gripped his notebook, his fingers steady now. He wrote in bold letters across the page. He said, "It's mine. Seat 1A is mine." For the first time since the ordeal began, he believed it fully. Not just because his father told him so, not just because a man in a suit declared it, but because he had stayed, through fear and doubt, and held his ground. The engines hummed louder outside, readying for takeoff. Inside, a different engine had begun to roar, the engine of justice, fueled by the quiet strength of a boy who refused to move, and a father whose voice echoed across miles like thunder. The cabin of Flight 782 had shifted from uneasy whispers to a taut silence after Richard Coleman's words cut through the air. His authority was undeniable. His posture radiated command. Still, Eleanor Briggs stood her ground in the aisle, fists clenched at her sides, unwilling to surrender the control she was accustomed to. "Seat 1A belongs to Mr. Malik Johnson," Richard repeated, his voice calm but unyielding. "And anyone who continues to question that is in violation of airline policy." Passengers shifted, some exchanging glances that carried a mix of relief and unease. It was rare to witness such open confrontation in a first-class cabin. Yet the tension clung to the air like static before a storm. Eleanor's face flushed crimson. Violation of policy. "Do you even realize what you're saying? I have flown this airline for over 20 years. I've logged more miles than anyone here. That boy doesn't belong in this seat." Her words pierced Malik's chest like thorns. He fought to steady his breath, gripping the notebook in his lap. But Richard didn't waver. "Enough. Mrs. Briggs," he said firmly. "This is not about loyalty programs. This is about fairness and dignity. Your behavior has disrupted this flight long enough." Susan Miller, still standing near the galley, cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. Coleman, We were only trying to... You were only trying to bend the rules for the sake of convenience," Richard snapped, turning his sharp gaze on her. "And in the process, you forgot the most basic responsibility of your job to treat every passenger with respect." The supervisor froze, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to defend herself, but couldn't find the words. Malik looked up at Richard, gratitude flickering in his eyes. For the first time since boarding, someone had spoken the truth aloud, cutting through the fog of doubt that had pressed against him. But Eleanor wasn't finished. Her voice rose, carrying across the cabin with practiced confidence. "This is ridiculous. Do you know who my husband is? He sits on your advisory council. I will have your job for this. You'll regret embarrassing me like this." A murmur rippled through the passengers. Some recoiled at her entitlement. Others looked away, unwilling to take sides. Malik's pulse quickened, wondering if her threats might carry real weight, but Richard's expression remained steady, carved from stone. "If your husband values his seat on the council, he will want to hear about your behavior today," Richard replied evenly. "Because this isn't just about you. This is about what kind of airline we are and what kind of values we uphold." The words landed with a force that silenced even Eleanor for a moment. She sputtered, searching for a retort, but none came. Richard then turned back to Susan Miller and Brian Scott. "Effective immediately. You and your crew are suspended pending investigation. You have failed to de-escalate. And worse, you participated in the harassment of a minor passenger. Gather your things and step aside." The announcement struck the cabin like lightning. Passengers gasped. Susan's face drained of all color, and Brian's jaw fell slack. "Sir, please," Susan begged, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean," but Richard cut her off, his voice final. "You meant exactly what you did, and it ends here." Malik felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that justice was being served, yet sorrow at the spectacle unfolding before him. He wasn't vindictive, but he couldn't ignore how these adults had tried to strip away his dignity piece by piece. Eleanor tried once more, her voice rising into a shrill pitch. "So that's it. You're siding with him, a boy who doesn't even understand the system. What about loyalty? What about respect for the people who keep this airline alive?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "Respect is not earned by status. It's earned by how you treat others. And today, Mrs. Briggs, you have failed spectacularly." The words echoed through the cabin, final and undeniable. Passengers began to murmur again, but this time the tone had shifted. A few clapped softly, hesitant at first, then with more courage. The sound grew not loud, but enough to fill the silence that Eleanor had dominated for so long. Malik's throat tightened. He lowered his gaze, hiding the tears threatening to fall. For hours he had been fighting to stay still, to stay silent, to hold on to his place. And now, in the face of applause, he felt something uncoil inside him, a deep, quiet pride. Susan and Brian reluctantly stepped aside, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the floor. Richard gave them no further acknowledgement, his focus solely on Malik now. "Young man," he said gently, his voice shifting from command to care, "I want to apologize to you personally. What you endured should never have happened. Seat 1A is yours. No one will question that again." Malik nodded, swallowing hard, unable to find words. He simply held his boarding pass tighter, as though it had transformed from paper into something sacred. Richard then addressed the passengers. We will depart shortly. Thank you for your patience. This airline will not tolerate discrimination from anyone at any time." The murmurs softened into silence. The tension had broken, and as Eleanor sank reluctantly into her assigned seat further back in the cabin, her shoulders rigid with humiliation, Malik allowed himself the smallest exhale of relief. The engines roared to life once more, the plane ready to take off. But for Malik, the true journey had already begun. He had faced the storm and remained seated, his dignity intact. And though he was only 15, in that moment he carried himself like a man who had learned what it meant to hold his ground. What he didn't yet know was that his father's calls had set in motion something even bigger than this cabin. The ripples were already spreading beyond the runway, toward a reckoning that would change the airline forever. The wheels of Flight 782 screeched against the runway at John F. Kennedy International. The sudden jolt pulling Malik from the haze of thoughts that had consumed him during the flight. The cabin, which had settled into uneasy silence after the confrontation, now buzzed faintly with the relief of landing. Passengers shifted in their seats, phones lighting up as people prepared to reconnect with the world. But Malik knew this flight wasn't over, not for him. He sat still in seat 1A, his seatbelt fastened, his notebook open on his lap. On the last page, in bold block letters, he had written, "I didn't move. I stayed." The words stared back at him like a quiet declaration of victory. Yet beneath the triumph lay the lingering ache of what it had cost him. Every whisper, every sigh, every set of eyes doubting him had pressed into his chest. The captain's voice came through the intercom, smoother than the turbulence of the past hours. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated as we taxi to the gate." As the plane rolled forward, Malik caught the sharp click of heels in the aisle. Eleanor Briggs rose from her seat before the seatbelt sign had dimmed, her defiance radiating even in small gestures. She tugged her jacket tighter, her chin lifted as though preparing for another battle. Richard Coleman's warning glance cut through the aisle. "Sit down, Mrs. Briggs. We are not finished here." She hesitated, then dropped back into her seat with a huff, her eyes shooting daggers at Malik. He lowered his gaze, refusing to give her the satisfaction of meeting it. When the plane finally docked, the doors opened, not to the usual bustle of disembarking passengers, but to the imposing presence of uniformed airline officials and two men in dark suits with identification badges clipped to their belts. The crew froze. Conversations died instantly. Richard Coleman stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "This flight is under immediate review. No one leaves until we finish our process." A ripple of shock swept through the passengers. Malik's stomach tightened, but then he noticed the way the men's eyes softened when they glanced at him, and his chest eased slightly. This wasn't about him being punished. This was about accountability. Susan Miller and Brian Scott exchanged panicked glances near the galley. One of the suited men gestured toward them. "You'll both come with us." Susan's voice cracked. "This isn't fair. We were just trying to do our jobs." But Richard's glare silenced her. "Your job is respect, and today you failed it." As they were escorted off, the cabin buzzed with low whispers. Some passengers filmed discreetly, phones tilted at odd angles. Malik realized the story was no longer contained in these walls. It would spread. It already had. Then, a second group boarded executives Malik didn't recognize, flanked by security. At their center was a tall man with a sharp jawline and salt and pepper hair. His badge read Robert Wexler, Senior Vice President of Operations. He carried the weight of authority in every step. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured, on behalf of Atlantic Airways. "I deeply apologize for the disruption you experienced today. This is not the standard we uphold." His eyes scanned the cabin, then settled firmly on Malik. "We will be addressing this matter immediately." Malik swallowed hard. The spotlight felt heavy, but also validating. For hours he had been painted as the problem. Now, in front of everyone, he was being acknowledged as the one wronged. Eleanor Briggs leapt to her feet. "This is absurd. You're apologizing to him. What about me? I'm a Platinum Elite member. I've kept this airline afloat with my loyalty for decades." Wexler didn't flinch. His tone cooled several degrees. "Mrs. Briggs, your behavior on this flight will be reviewed. Until further notice, your platinum status is suspended." The gasp that followed was louder than anything before. Eleanor's face drained of color, her mouth opening as if to scream. But no sound emerged. She collapsed back into her seat, trembling with indignation. For the first time, Malik felt a flicker of justice bloom in the pit of his stomach. Passengers began to murmur louder now, some supportive, some in shock. Walters gave Malik a quiet nod, his lined face filled with approval. "Mrs.?" Daniels offered a warm smile, her earlier encouragement now glowing like a lantern in the dark. The executives conferred briefly. Then Richard Coleman addressed Malik directly. "Mr. Johnson, your father has been in contact with us throughout this incident. He made it clear that your treatment would not go unanswered. I want you to know he's on his way." Malik's heart jolted. His father. Here before he could process. The cabin doors opened again. There he was, David Johnson, tall, dignified, his presence commanding without a word. He wore no tie. His shirt sleeves rolled, but his aura outshone every suit in the cabin. Passengers straightened instinctively, sensing the gravity of the man before them. Malik's eyes stung as relief surged through him. He hadn't realized how desperately he needed to see his father until this moment. David approached Seat 1A slowly, his gaze sweeping across the attendants, the executives, the passengers, and finally resting on his son. He placed a firm hand on Malik's shoulder, his voice steady but full of warmth. "You did well, son. You held your ground." Malik looked up, blinking back tears. "I was scared. Dad, everyone wanted me to move." David's hand tightened reassuringly. "And yet, you didn't. That's what matters." He straightened, addressing the cabin with a voice that filled the space without needing volume. "My son had a boarding pass for seat 1A. That should have been the end of the discussion. Instead, he was humiliated, pressured, and treated as if he didn't belong. That will not happen again. Not to him. Not to anyone." The silence that followed was absolute. Passengers felt the weight of his words, the quiet thunder of a man who had power but used it to protect dignity, not crush it. Robert Wexler inclined his head respectfully. "Mr. Johnson, we are launching a full investigation. The crew involved has been suspended, and Mrs. Briggs." He glanced sharply at Eleanor as no longer a Platinum Elite member. Eleanor let out a strangled sound, but David ignored her. His focus remained on Malik, who sat taller now, his father's hand still anchoring him. Passengers began to clap, soft at first, then louder, filling the cabin with a rhythm that drowned out the shame, the anger, the fear. It wasn't applause for drama, it was applause for justice. And Malik, for the first time that day, smiled without hesitation. The terminal at JFK was buzzing with the usual chaos of rolling suitcases, hurried announcements, and travelers weaving through the crowd. But at Gate 42 the air was heavy with something different. A makeshift barrier had been erected near the jet bridge, where a cluster of executives and officials stood waiting. Passengers from Flight 782 disembarked slowly, their faces etched with curiosity and disbelief. Some whispered into phones, already sharing their version of the story. Others lingered to watch, sensing they had witnessed the start of something larger. Malik walked beside his father, still clutching his notebook. The leather seat of 1A was behind him now, but the weight of it still lingered in his chest. David's hand rested on his shoulder, firm and steady, guiding him forward like a compass through the swirl of eyes and whispers. Richard Coleman and Robert Wexler flanked them as they moved. Security trailed close, ensuring no one approached. Susan Miller and Brian Scott, pale and trembling, were being led in another direction, toward a room marked Operations. Eleanor Briggs had already been escorted away, her voice echoing faintly from down the hall, shrill with indignation. Inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking the runway, Malik and David were invited to sit. The room was modern but sterile polished table, leather chairs, screens mounted on the wall. A carafe of water sat untouched at the center. Richard closed the blinds before taking his place at the far end, his face unreadable, but his posture protective. Robert Wexler leaned forward, hands folded. "Mr. Johnson, Malik, I want to begin by apologizing again. What happened on Flight 782 is not who we are as an airline, nor what we stand for. A full investigation is already underway." David's voice was calm but carried an edge like tempered steel. Apologies are words. What matters is what you do now. Malik shifted in his chair, his small hands tracing the edges of his notebook. He wanted to disappear into the background, but every pair of eyes in the room seemed to rest on him. Wexler nodded gravely. "You're right, which is why we are not handling this quietly. The crew has been suspended pending formal review, and Mrs. Briggs's status has been revoked. But this goes deeper than a single flight." He paused, his gaze moving between father and son. "We've uncovered complaints about these same crew members before incidents dismissed or overlooked. This is systemic." Malik's head lifted at the word. He didn't know much about corporations, but he understood that systemic meant it wasn't just about one bad moment. It was about a pattern, a machine that kept running even when it hurt people like him. David's jaw tightened. "Then you have a choice to make. You can treat this as damage control, or you can dismantle the culture that allowed it to happen." The room went quiet. Outside, planes roared against the runway, but in here, every word carried weight. Richard broke the silence, his voice lower, more personal. "Mr. Johnson, Malik, I was on that flight because I believed your father's call mattered, and I will stand by what I said. Respect isn't bought by status. If this airline is going to survive, it has to change." Malik watched the exchange with wide eyes. He had never seen his father in this light, not just a parent, but a force. Calm, steady, but unyielding, like a mountain. And yet, beneath it all, Malik sensed the undercurrent of love. Every call, every demand, every stern word, it was all to protect him. Wexler exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Mr. Johnson, your company provides critical infrastructure to our operations. I'd be lying if I said that didn't weigh on us today. But beyond that, your son's courage forced us to see ourselves. If he hadn't held his ground, we might still be ignoring these cracks." Malik blinked, startled by the praise. Him courageous. His stomach still twisted when he remembered the whispers, the stares, the suffocating pressure to give up. But maybe that was courage staying seated even when every part of you wanted to run. David placed a hand on his son's back, a subtle gesture of pride. Then he looked directly at Wexler. "You will convene a cultural audit. You will implement independent oversight for discrimination complaints. And you will institute mandatory training that teaches your people how to treat passengers with dignity. Not because I demand it, but because you should have done it long ago." Wexler hesitated only for a breath before nodding. "Yes, we will, and I want both of you to be part of shaping that process." Malik's eyes widened. "Us. Yes." "Malik," Richard said softly, "your story is already spreading. Videos from the flight are online. People are talking. You have a voice now, and people will listen." The thought sent a shiver down Malik's spine. He wasn't sure he wanted that kind of attention. He was just a boy who hadn't wanted to give up his seat. But when he looked at his father, he saw something else, the chance to make his pain matter, to make it change something bigger than himself. David's voice gentled, his gaze on Malik. "Son, sometimes we don't choose the moment chooses us. What matters is what we do with it." Malik swallowed hard, nodding slowly. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. An assistant entered, holding a tablet. She whispered to Wexler, who glanced at the screen before sighing. "It's already begun. The story is trending nationwide. Hashtags, news outlets, all of it." Malik's chest tightened. He imagined his face on screens, strangers dissecting his every move, questioning him, doubting him, praising him. It felt overwhelming. David sensed his unease. "Don't worry. Malik, let them talk. You did nothing wrong. You showed the world what it looks like to stand firm." The boy leaned into his father's side, the steady warmth of his presence grounding him. Wexler stood, straightening his jacket. "We'll draft a formal statement tonight, but, Mr. Johnson, Malik, would you be willing to speak at the press conference tomorrow? Not for us, for yourselves." Malik's eyes darted to his father. He wanted to say no, to shrink back into silence. But then he remembered the clapping in the cabin, the nods of Walters, the smile of Mrs. Daniels. He remembered the moment Richard said, "Seat 1A is yours." His hand tightened around his notebook. He opened it to the page where he had written, "I didn't move. I stayed." He read the words again, his heart beating steadier. "I'll try," he said softly. David's hand squeezed his shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask." As they left the room, Malik glanced back once at the glass walls. The reflection staring back at him wasn't just a boy in a hoodie clutching a notebook. It was someone who had sat in seat 1A and refused to surrender. And now, somehow, that choice was about to change more than just one flight. Morning sunlight spilled across the glass facade of Atlantic Airways' New York headquarters, catching the lenses of dozens of cameras stationed outside. Reporters jostled for position, microphones raised, questions already flying before the doors had even opened. The story of Flight 782 had swept across the nation overnight, igniting debates on talk shows, in living rooms, and across social media feeds. Hashtags like "Ma Seat 1A" and "Ass Flying While Black" trended globally. What had begun as a confrontation in a cabin had grown into a cultural moment. Inside, Malik Johnson sat in a quiet room with his father. His notebook lay open on his knees, but for once, the pages remained blank. His hands trembled, not from fear of losing a seat this time, but from the weight of stepping into a world much larger than himself. David Johnson adjusted his tie in the mirror, his expression calm yet fierce. He turned to Malik, placing both hands on his son's shoulders. "Remember, Malik, just speak the truth. You don't have to be anyone but yourself." Malik nodded, his throat dry. He wanted to believe his father's words, but doubt still swirled. What if he stumbled? What if people twisted his story? Yet when he looked into his father's steady eyes, he felt the familiar anchor. He would try. A knock at the door. Richard Coleman entered, his presence both reassuring and urgent. "It's time. The press is restless. They're expecting answers." Malik rose slowly, his knees weak, but his father's hand at his back steadied him. Together, they followed Richard through the narrow hallway toward the stage set up in the lobby. The air buzzed with tension, anticipation thick enough to touch. As they stepped into the light, a wave of camera flashes erupted. The hum of voices swelled, then stilled as Robert Wexler took the podium first. His voice carried the authority of the airline, but with a humility that was rarely heard in such spaces. "Yesterday, on Flight 782, one of our passengers was subjected to treatment that was unacceptable and contrary to the values this airline must stand for. A young man with a valid boarding pass for Seat 1A was pressured, humiliated, and told he did not belong. That is not who we are or who we will be moving forward." Murmurs rippled through the room. Wexler raised a hand, steadying the crowd. "We are launching sweeping reforms to ensure that discrimination of any kind is confronted directly. And today, we are honored to stand beside the family at the center of this moment." He stepped aside, gesturing toward David and Malik. The applause was immediate, though uneven, a mix of genuine support and polite acknowledgement. Malik felt the weight of every eye, every camera, every expectation pressing down on him. David guided him gently toward the podium. "Go on, son," he whispered. Malik gripped the edges of the stand, the microphone towering above him. He had to tilt it downward slightly. His heart pounded in his ears, but when he glanced at his father, then at Richard standing nearby, he drew a breath that steadied his shaking hands. "My name is Malik Johnson." He began softly. His voice wavered, but the microphone carried it across the room. "I'm 15 years old. Yesterday, I sat in seat 1A because my father bought me that ticket. But people told me I didn't belong there. They told me to move. They made me feel small." A hush fell over the room. The cameras clicked, but even the reporters stilled, listening. Malik continued, his words gathering strength as he spoke. "I wanted to give up. I was scared. Everyone was angry, but I remembered what my dad told me, that I had the right to sit where my ticket said. So I stayed. I didn't move." He lifted his notebook, opening to the page where the words were written in bold ink. "I didn't move. I stayed." He held it up for all to see. "This isn't just about a seat," he said, his voice stronger now. "It's about dignity. It's about being seen and treated with respect, no matter who you are or what you look like. No one should feel like they don't belong." The silence was heavy, thick with emotion. Reporters' pens froze mid-scribble. A few eyes glistened. Malik lowered the notebook slowly. "I'm not special. I'm just a kid. But yesterday, I had to make a choice, and I hope no other kid ever has to make that choice again." The applause that followed wasn't polite this time. It was loud, insistent, a rising wave that filled the lobby. Malik blinked rapidly, overwhelmed, but a small smile tugged at his lips. He had spoken. He had been heard. David stepped forward next, his presence towering. "My son showed courage yesterday, but let's be clear, he should never have had to. We will hold Atlantic Airways accountable, and we will work with them to build systems that protect every passenger. This is bigger than one flight. It's about building a culture where dignity is not negotiable." As he spoke, reporters scribbled furiously, cameras rolled, and the world outside waited to hear more. But the true twist of the morning was yet to come. One reporter raised her hand, her voice sharp. "Mr. Johnson, forgive me, but are you not the same David Johnson, CEO of AeroCore Technologies, the company that provides critical infrastructure for nearly half of Atlantic Airways operations?" A collective gasp swept through the room. Malik's eyes widened. He turned to his father, suddenly understanding why the executives had reacted with such fear, why Richard had come himself, why Robert Wexler had bent so quickly. David met the reporter's gaze without flinching. "Yes, I am. But today, I am here as a father. My son's dignity does not depend on my title, and neither should anyone else's." The lobby erupted in flashes and voices, questions tumbling over one another. The revelation igniting a new firestorm. Reporters shouted about conflicts of interest, about leverage, about what this meant for the airline, but Malik wasn't thinking about power or politics. He looked at his father, realizing that the strength he had leaned on all this time came not just from influence or wealth, but from a conviction that dignity was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As the conference drew to a close, David placed a hand on Malik's back once more, guiding him through the crowd. The cameras followed, but Malik didn't hide this time. He walked taller, notebook clutched to his chest, his words still echoing in the air. He had spoken, he had stayed, and the world had listened. The days following the press conference blurred into a storm of headlines, debates, and relentless attention. Malik's face, captured mid-sentence at the podium, appeared on every screen in news broadcasts, on magazine covers, across social media feeds. For the first time, the boy who once felt invisible was being seen by millions. And yet, Malik didn't crave the spotlight. What mattered to him wasn't fame, but the truth that his voice, his simple refusal to move, had started something larger than himself. Atlantic Airways scrambled to respond. Robert Wexler announced sweeping changes, a full-scale cultural audit, independent oversight for passenger complaints, and new protocols for crew training called the Clear Sky Initiative. In every terminal, posters and announcements declared the airline's new commitment: every passenger, every seat, equal respect. The suspended crew faced disciplinary hearings. Susan Miller and Brian Scott were stripped of their positions, their careers with the airline effectively over. Eleanor Briggs's name vanished from the Platinum Elite roster, her status revoked permanently. For a woman who built her identity on privilege, the loss cut deep. But for Malik, justice wasn't measured by who fell. It was measured by what rose in their place. One evening, weeks later, Malik sat at the kitchen table at home in Houston. The familiar smell of his mother's cooking drifted from the stove, grounding him in normalcy. His notebook lay open before him, pages filled with his shaky handwriting from that long day. Across the last page, he had scrawled in larger letters, "Dignity is not negotiable." David joined him, setting down a cup of tea. "You've carried a lot these past weeks. Son, how are you holding up?" Malik shrugged, his eyes on the page. "It's strange. Everyone calls me brave, but I didn't feel brave. I just felt scared. Scared, but stuck. I thought I'd break if I stayed." David leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. Malik, it's about standing firm even when fear tells you to give in. You did that, and people saw it. They'll remember it." Malik hesitated, then whispered, "Why me? Why did it have to be me?" David placed a hand over his son's. "Because sometimes, Malik, change begins with the person no one expects. A boy in seat 1A can shake a system if he refuses to move. And you did." The boy nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. Meanwhile, across the country, ripple effects spread. Advocacy groups praised Malik for embodying the resilience of black youth often dismissed in silence. Parents used his story to teach their children about dignity and courage. Even airlines beyond Atlantic began reviewing their policies, wary of becoming the next headline. A month later, Malik returned to school. His classmates, who had once teased him for being quiet, now looked at him differently. Some admired him, others whispered with awe, a few even asked for autographs. Malik smiled shyly, but reminded them, "I'm still just Malik." One afternoon, his teacher invited him to speak in front of the class about his experience. Malik stood at the front, notebook in hand, heart racing just as it had at the press conference. But when he opened his mouth, the words flowed more easily this time. "I didn't move because my dad told me I deserved to be there. But what I learned is that we all deserve to be seen and respected. No one should be told they don't belong. Not in a seat, not anywhere." His classmates clapped, and Malik realized his story was no longer just his. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt pushed aside. At Atlantic Airways headquarters, reforms were underway. Richard Coleman now led the cultural training program, often citing Malik's story as the turning point. Robert Wexler personally oversaw the new Complaint Oversight Board, ensuring that every report was logged, reviewed, and acted upon. The company even established a mentorship initiative called the Gateways Program, designed to empower frontline staff to act with empathy and integrity. And in a symbolic gesture, Seat 1A on every Atlantic Airways aircraft was marked with a small plaque reserved for dignity. When Malik and his father boarded a flight months later, bound for Washington, D.C., to attend a congressional hearing on airline accountability. Malik paused at the seat. The plaque gleamed under the cabin lights. Passengers around them whispered, recognizing the boy who had started it all. David placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "You see, son, a seat is just leather and steel, but dignity, that's something people can carry forever." Malik sat down, this time with no fear, no doubt, just quiet pride. The congressional hearing was packed with lawmakers, reporters, and advocates. Malik spoke softly but firmly, retelling his story, holding his notebook as though it were part of him. His words echoed in the chamber. "We shouldn't need power to be respected. We should only need to be human." The room fell silent. his voice landing like truth too sharp to ignore. When he finished, the applause was long and loud, not for spectacle, but for the reminder that justice often begins with the smallest refusal. That night, Malik lay in bed, the city lights of Washington glowing faintly through the hotel curtains. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "I stayed. And because I stayed, something changed." He closed the book and smiled. For the first time, the weight he had carried since that flight felt lighter, not gone, but transformed. What began as a boy clinging to a seat had become a movement about belonging, dignity, and justice. And though he was still only 15, Malik Johnson knew one thing for certain. Siet 1A had taught him not just where he belonged, but who he was. Months had passed since that fateful day on Flight 782, but for Malik Johnson, life still carried the echoes of the seat he refused to surrender. He returned to his ordinary routine school, basketball practice, quiet evenings with his family, but nothing felt entirely ordinary anymore. People looked at him differently now. Some saw him as a symbol of courage, others as a headline. But Malik himself just wanted to live without constantly being reminded of the moment that changed everything. Yet, as much as he longed for normalcy, Malik began to notice how far the ripples had spread. Letters poured into his home, handwritten notes from strangers thanking him for showing dignity in the face of discrimination. Parents wrote about their own children who stood taller after hearing his story. Teachers requested permission to use his speech in classrooms. One letter came from an older man who recalled being forced to give up his seat on a bus decades earlier. "You carried the strength we only wished we had," it read. Malik read each letter slowly, often in silence, his notebook open beside him. He copied down phrases that struck him. "You reminded us we matter. Your courage gave me hope." Sometimes the words filled him with pride. Other times they felt like a weight pressing down on his young shoulders. He never asked to be anyone's hero. He just wanted to sit in the seat his father had bought. One evening, David found Malik sitting on the porch, a stack of letters in his lap. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold. David sat beside him, letting the quiet stretch before speaking. "You look like a boy carrying the world," he said softly. Malik frowned. "What if I can't live up to what people think I am? They say I'm brave, but I was scared the whole time. What if they find out I'm just me?" David placed a steady hand on his son's back. "Being brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing what's right even when you're trembling inside. Malik, you don't need to live up to their image. You just need to live your truth. That's enough." Malik let the words settle, staring at the horizon. Maybe his father was right. Maybe courage wasn't about being perfect. It was about choosing not to move when everything around you told you to. Meanwhile, Atlantic Airways pushed forward with reforms. The Clear Sky Initiative was rolled out across all terminals. Crew members underwent immersive training programs where actors recreated tense scenarios and forced employees to confront their biases. Passenger complaint systems were revamped, creating a transparent channel that could no longer be buried under bureaucracy. Richard Coleman invited Malik and David to sit in on one of the first training sessions. Malik watched quietly from the back of the room as a young flight attendant hesitated when an actor playing a minority passenger questioned his treatment. The attendant stammered, then corrected himself, acknowledging the passenger's dignity with calm respect. Richard turned to Malik with a faint smile. "This is the change you sparked," he whispered. Malik felt a warmth in his chest. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about hundreds of flights, thousands of passengers, each one deserving dignity no matter who they were. The change rippled outward beyond Atlantic Airways. Competing airlines announced their own reforms, unwilling to be left behind. Lawmakers in Washington debated stricter regulations to prevent discrimination in air travel, citing Malik's testimony as a turning point. The phrase Seat 1A became shorthand in the media for standing firm against injustice. At school, Malik still wrestled with the attention. Some classmates treated him like a celebrity, while others envied him, whispering behind his back. But a moment came that quieted the noise. A younger student approached him timidly in the hallway. She was small, with a stutter that often made her the target of teasing. Holding a wrinkled copy of his press conference speech, she whispered, "I didn't let them take my lunch seat today because I remembered what you said. I stayed." Malik blinked, stunned. For a moment, he saw himself in her eyes, the same fear, the same doubt. And then he smiled, realizing that maybe the greatest impact wasn't in the headlines, but in the quiet courage it sparked in others. At home, the Johnson family found ways to heal together. Malik's mother, who had stayed in the background during the chaos, began encouraging Malik to write not only about what happened, but also about how he felt. "Your voice doesn't have to stop at that flight," she said. "You can carry it into the future." Malik filled notebook after notebook, scribbling late into the night. David, meanwhile, continued balancing his roles as CEO and father. The world wanted to see him as the powerful executive who had the leverage to demand change. But at home, he was simply the man making sure his son had dinner, that homework was done, that Malik remembered to rest, behind closed doors. David admitted to his wife that he had feared his influence would overshadow Malik's courage. "But the truth," he said quietly, "is that the boy carried more strength than I ever could." The culmination came one crisp autumn morning, when Malik and his father were invited to a university auditorium in Atlanta to speak before students and community leaders. Malik stood on the stage, looking out at hundreds of faces. This time, he didn't shake. He read from his notebook, his voice clear and strong. "I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to sit in my seat. But what I learned is that sometimes the smallest choice can echo far beyond what we imagine. I stayed because my father told me I belonged. And now, I tell you, you belong. Wherever life tries to push you out, wherever someone tells you you're not enough, remember Seat 1A. Remember that your dignity is not negotiable." The applause was thunderous, but Malik didn't linger in the spotlight. He closed his notebook, smiled shyly, and stepped back, his father's proud hand on his shoulder. That night, as they drove home, Malik gazed out the window at the city lights. For the first time since that day on the plane, he didn't feel like a boy caught in a storm. He felt like part of something bigger, a tide of change that he had helped set in motion. He opened his notebook and wrote one last line before closing his eyes to rest. "I stayed, and the world moved with me." Years passed, and the memory of Flight 782 settled into history books, documentaries, and countless classroom discussions. Yet, for Malik Johnson, the story never felt like a relic. It lived within him, shaping the way he saw himself and the world. He was no longer the timid boy gripping a notebook in Seat 1A. He had grown into a young man, carrying that same notebook, its worn pages now joined by shelves of journals chronicling his journey. At 25, Malik walked through the polished halls of AeroCorps' new headquarters in Atlanta, not as the son of David Johnson, but as a voice in his own right. He had chosen a different path than many expected. While his father remained at the helm of AeroCorps Technologies, Malik pursued social advocacy, working with nonprofits focused on dignity in travel and equity in education. He became known as a quiet leader, someone who preferred small gatherings in community centers over grand stages, but whose words still carried power. One autumn evening, he was invited to speak at a youth conference hosted by a coalition of civil rights groups. The auditorium was packed with young faces, some eager, some weary, all searching for guidance. Malik stepped to the podium, his old notebook tucked under his arm. Its cover was faded, corners bent, but it remained his anchor. I was 15 when I sat in a seat people told me I didn't deserve. Malik began, his voice steady, deeper now with age. I thought courage meant being fearless, but that day I was terrified. My heart pounded, my hands shook, and yet I stayed. What I learned is that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to hold your ground even when you're afraid. The audience leaned in, the silence heavy with attention. Malik flipped the notebook open, turning to the familiar page. I didn't move. I stayed. He smiled softly. These words changed my life. Not because they made me famous, but because they reminded me that dignity is something no one can take away unless you give it up. He closed the notebook and looked out over the crowd. Many of you here know what it feels like to be told you don't belong. In classrooms, in workplaces, on playgrounds, on planes. But hear me now, you do belong. Your worth isn't measured by someone else's comfort. It's measured by your humanity. And that is not negotiable. Applause swelled, but Malik didn't bask in it. He stepped back, letting the message settle like seeds in fertile ground. Later that night, as he walked out into the crisp air, Malik paused on the steps of the auditorium. David Johnson waited by the car, his hair now streaked with gray, but his posture still proud, steady as ever. You sounded like a man who knows his place in the world, David said, his voice tinged with quiet pride. Malik chuckled, slipping the notebook back into his bag. I'm still figuring it out, but I know one thing: I won't let anyone else decide it for me. David nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. That's all I ever wanted for you. As they drove through the city, Malik gazed out at the skyline, lit with the glow of progress. Billboards displayed messages of equality. Airlines promoted their new commitments to fairness, and schools taught children about dignity through stories like his. The world hadn't been perfected. Racism and injustice still lingered, as stubborn as ever, but change was visible, undeniable, and he knew he had been part of it. That night, Malik sat at his desk, opening a fresh journal. He wrote slowly, savoring each word. I stayed, and because I stayed, the world kept moving toward justice. He closed the journal and leaned back, a quiet smile on his lips. His journey wasn't finished, perhaps it never would be, but he no longer feared the weight of expectation. Instead, he carried it with grace, knowing that courage, once sparked, never truly dies. It passes from one voice to another, from one seat to the next, until the world itself shifts somewhere. He imagined a child sitting in a classroom, hearing his story for the first time. Maybe that child would feel the same fear he once felt, the same doubt. And maybe, when the moment came, that child would remember Malik Johnson, the boy in Seat 1A who refused to move. And in that moment, Malik knew the legacy was not about him. It was about everyone who dared to claim their place in the world, no matter how small the seat or how loud the voices telling them to stand. The epilogue of Flight 782 was not written in news headlines or corporate reforms, but in the quiet and stubborn dignity of people who refused to give in. Malik smiled at the thought, then closed his notebook for the night. The world outside buzzed with the noise of progress, but inside, he felt a steady peace. For once, he didn't feel like he was carrying the world. He simply felt like himself, Malik Johnson, son, advocate, man who stayed, and that was enough. The story of Malik Johnson reminds us that dignity is not something granted by privilege. It is a birthright of every human being. Too often in life, we are faced with moments where the world tells us we don't belong at work, in communities, or even in our own families. The temptation to step aside, to give up our seat, can be overwhelming. But Malik's courage teaches us that holding our ground, even in silence, can be transformative. For older generations especially, this lesson resonates deeply. Many have lived through times when giving in felt safer than resisting, when staying quiet seemed easier than standing tall. Yet Malik's story shows that even one quiet refusal can ripple into profound change. It reminds us that our choices, whether small or large, carry the power to inspire others, to demand justice, and to leave behind a legacy of respect. In our own lives, we may not sit in Seat 1A, but we each face our own flights where dignity is challenged. In those moments, let us remember staying firm is not just about pride, but about affirming the humanity we all share. Thank you for watching and for sharing this powerful journey with us. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep these stories alive and keep the message of dignity and justice moving forward.